Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to talk about the kind of multilingual science that you are likely to encounter in your everyday life, especially if you live in a big city. In particular, I'm making reference to those famous welcome multilingual signs such as this one or this one. Why are they so popular nowadays? What is the real meaning behind them? Are they always reflective of a global and cosmopolitan understanding of the world, or are they sometimes inconsistent with underlying practices of that particular institution or company? Let's find out. So what I mean by multilingual hype is the use and abuse of graphic representations of multilingualism for the purpose of promotional publicity of an extravagant or contrived kind. What I'm going to show you are meta-linguistic works of art because they contain an element of stylization, performance, or other type of linguistic self-reflexivity, manipulation, or display, where language is turned into a commodity that no longer functions referentially, but symbolically. It is not about what any of these words actually mean. You can always tell that these signs are saying welcome in any language. It's not about that. It's not about what they mean, although the content ought to be positive in some sense, but what they symbolize. The spectacularized juxtaposition of not only different languages, but also different scripts draws upon an aesthetic of word things and language objects to enregister and perform these spaces as transcending the boundaries of the types of ethno-national identities that correspond to each specific language code into a new shared domain where all of them are celebrated and exploited as markers of modernity and internationalization. That domain is the global and the cosmopolitan world. Now, this global consumer register, which has been called Globalese, is part of the imagery of so-called Banal globalism, which is particularly salient in contemporary urban spaces. Although premised on diversity, this is also a reasonably consistent register. Why? Because it needs to be formulaic, recognizable, and accessible to as many onlookers/consumers as possible, which is to say, it needs to allow for the mass consumerism of global linguistic uniqueness. So it seems to me that there is a fundamental tension in all of these examples between, on the one hand, an outward, overt projection of tolerance, diversity, acceptance, and inclusivity through the use of multilingualism in multiple scripts. And on the other hand, the real underlying practices of that institution or company. Now, there are three ways in which these two elements can converge. It can be first the case that projection of inclusivity and tolerance is actually reflective of the real practices of that institution. In other words, that institution is actually tolerant, inclusive, accepting of diversity, etc. In that case, excellent. Congratulations to that company. We're moving things forward. We're making a positive difference in the world. However, the second way in which it can be articulated is in a case where that projection of tolerance and inclusivity and diversity through multilingualism is inconsistent with the practices of that institution or company. In other words, that institution or company presents itself as diverse and tolerant, but in reality, it is not accepting of diversity. In reality, it continues to use practices that are discriminatory on the grounds of race, accent, looks, etc. And that is a form of banal multilingualism. It's multilingual in its projection, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because its practices are inconsistent with that projection of tolerance and diversity. And finally, in the third place, we have a situation where that projection of tolerance, acceptance of diversity, etc., through multilingualism is not only inconsistent with the underlying practices of that institution or company, it is actually designed to prevent people from realizing the extent to which those practices are discriminatory, monolingual, not accepting of diversity, etc. In that case, we're no longer talking about banal multilingualism, because banal implies trivial, innocuous, that doesn't have an impact in the world. But this has an impact in the world, a pernicious one. So it's no longer a case of banal multilingualism. Now it's a case of cynical multilingualism, a type of multilingualism that does the opposite of its public image and does that on purpose. Consider, for instance, the following quote. Any self-respecting institution today says, "Welcome multilingually." The signs are intended to send a message of cosmopolitanism, but it's a message that is intended for the dominant population so they can feel good about themselves. So again, it's not done by accident. It's not that this institution is trying to be tolerant and inclusive, but failing to do so despite their effort, but they know already too well that their end goal is not to be more inclusive and more tolerant of diversity, but rather to make people feel good about themselves without enacting any real change. So in conclusion, from the fact that we see slightly over-the-top multilingual signs every day in the urban landscape, we cannot conclude necessarily any of the three possibilities. All of them are possible. It might be the case that those multilingual signs are reflective of an underlying practice of tolerance and respect for diversity in the workplace. It can also be the case that they are inconsistent and that company is discriminatory, so that those practices are not consistent with those multilingual signs. And it can also be the case that they are not consistent and they were never intended to be consistent with the outward and overt projection of tolerance implied in those multilingual signs. So next time you come across one of those multilingual signs, bear in mind these three possibilities. Hope you found this video useful, and as always, thanks for watching.